In the wet spring of 1979, 6 weeks after her husband's tractor rolled twice down the levee bank and left her a widow at 26, Odessa Prine stood in the county extension office and was handed a crate of 120 runt ducklings nobody else would take, culls from a failing hatchery 2 counties over, $7 for the lot, because the man behind the counter said that was what garbage cost when somebody had to haul it off. Her husband's brothers had already split the good bottomland between them that morning, the 12 flat acres that grew rice sweet as anywhere in the parish, and they had not bothered lowering their voices when they laughed about what was left for her. 3 acres of paddy so chewed up by rice water weevil that nothing had come up green on it in 4 seasons. Everyone at that table agreed the weevil ground was a mercy nobody wanted to be caught taking credit for. Her father-in-law patted her hand and told her not to worry, that the county would understand if she let the lease go by June. It took her 1 full growing season of walking that ruined Paddy with a crate of ugly ducklings under her arm to understand what her husband had actually left her the deed to. The extension officer had not wanted to sell her the ducklings at all. At first, he'd wanted to burn the crate behind the hatchery like the culls from the season before, because runts brought disease down on a flock, and no serious farmer would touch them. He only relented when Odessa put the $7 on the counter in wet, wrinkled bills she'd found folded into her husband's Bible, money he'd apparently been saving for something he never got to name. The brothers-in-law had the tractor, the 2 mules, the good seed drill, and the house with the working well. Odessa got the tenant shack with the sagging porch, the Paddy the county assessor had marked as a total loss 2 years running, and now 120 ducks so small and sickly yellow that 3 of them died in the truck bed on the ride home. Nobody in that county office thought she would make it to harvest. Her sister-in-law Vera said it plain, standing by the door with her coat already buttoned. That land's finished, Odessa, and so is wasting good money keeping fowl alive that ought to already be dead. What none of them knew, what even Odessa didn't understand yet, as she carried that crate up the porch steps in the rain, was that her husband had walked that weevil-eaten Paddy every evening the month before he died, and that he had written something down about it in a ledger she had not yet found. The shack had 1 working lamp and a stove that smoked when the wind came from the north, and Odessa spent her first night back in it listening to 117 ducklings peep in a washtub she'd dragged in from the yard because she did not trust the cold to leave any of them alive by morning. She had grown up on a place like this 1 county over, had watched her own mother nurse 6 stock back with nothing but patience and boiled egg yolk, and some of that came back to her hands now without her having to think about it. By the 2nd week, she had lost only 9 more, which the man at the feed store called a minor miracle for stock that bad, though he said it like an insult, like she'd wasted a miracle on something worthless. She carried the survivors down to the paddy each morning in a bushel basket, because ducks belonged on water and water was the one thing that ruined ground still had plenty of, and she watched them paddle out across the flooded rows, pecking at whatever moved beneath the surface. It was the 2nd month, in the gray hour before the mosquitoes got bad, that she noticed the ducks were spending most of their time in the northeast corner of the paddy, the corner closest to the old dry well nobody had drawn water from in a decade, diving and surfacing with something in their bills that was not weed and was not grain. She waded out to sea for herself, sinking to her calves in warm brown water, and found the mud there thick with drowned weevils, more of them than she had ever seen in one place, dead and dying by the hundreds, and past them, half buried and green with algae, the corner of something metal. She did not tell anyone about the metal corner in the mud, not that first day, because her hands were shaking too hard from cold water and something else to trust what she'd felt, and because Vera had already started telling people in town that the widow had lost her sense-keeping ducks on a dead paddy. Odessa went back after dark instead, with a lantern and a hay hook, and worked the object free of 4 years of silt, while bullfrogs called from the ditch, and her ducks slept huddled in their crate on the bank. It came up heavy, longer than a bread box, sealed at the seams with tar that had cracked but held, and by the time she got it up onto dry ground, her arms were shaking from more than the cold. She carried it into the shack and set it on the kitchen table beside the lamp, and she sat looking at it for a long while before she found the courage to work the latch, because some part of her already understood that, whatever her husband had buried in that corner of ruined ground, In the one place on the property nobody else would ever think to wade through mud and duckweed to search, he had buried it there on purpose, and that the ducks had found it only because ducks go where the weevils are, and the weevils, it turned out, had been going somewhere too. Odessa Prine had married into rice the way some women marry into money or into grief, without knowing yet which one it would turn out to be. For husband Wendell had inherited the Paddies from his own father, 3 brothers splitting 16 acres of Arkansas Delta bottomland that flooded every spring whether the almanac promised rain or not, and for 6 years she had walked those levees beside him, learning to read water the way other women read weather off a porch. The rice water weevil had come to the northeast 3 acres first, back when Wendell's father was still alive to see it, a pest no bigger than a grain of rice itself that laid its eggs in the mud around the roots and let its larvae eat a crop from beneath the waterline, where no eye could catch the damage until the stand came up yellow and thin as an old man's hair. Wendell had fought it with everything the extension office recommended, had drained and reflooded on their schedule, had rotated soybeans through it for 2 seasons hoping to starve the cycle out, and none of it had taken. By the time the tractor rolled on him on the levee road, that corner of the farm had not produced a harvestable stand in 4 years running, and the assessor's office had it marked in red ink as agricultural waste, valued for tax purposes at less than the shack that stood beside it. The morning of the reading of the will, Odessa sat in a hard chair in the front room of Wendell's father's house, between Vera in her good church dress and Wendell's older brother Cole in his church boots, and listened to a lawyer from Monroe read out a will that gave the working land, the tractor, the mules, the seed drill, and the family house to the 2 surviving brothers in equal shares, and gave to Odessa, married in but not born to it, the ruined 3 acres and the tenant shack that sat on its edge, structures the lawyer described, without looking up from his paper, as of negligible remaining value. Cole did not smile outright, because he had been raised not to, but something eased in his shoulders that she recognized as relief, the relief of a man who had feared being asked to share something worth having, and found instead that the sharing had already been done for him by a dead man's own hand. Vera reached over and patted Odessa's knee in a gesture that might have passed for comfort in a room with less silence in it, and murmured that the Lord provides, though what exactly he was providing in 3 acres of weevil ground went unspecified. Odessa signed where the lawyer pointed and walked out into a March wind that still had winter's teeth in it, and stood in the yard of the house she would never sleep in again, looking down the gravel road toward the shack that was now, entirely and only, hers. The shack had been built for a hired hand 2 generations back, 1 room and a lean-to kitchen, a stovepipe patched with a coffee can lid, and a porch whose boards had silvered and cupped from decades of rain. Odessa moved what little was hers into it in a single wagon trip, borrowed from a neighbor who would not meet her eyes while he drove, as though poverty were catching, and he did not want to breathe the same air as it too long. She swept 4 years of dust and mouse droppings from the floorboards, stuffed newspaper into the gaps around the window frames, and by the time she sat down that first night to eat cold biscuits by lamplight, her hands had blistered in 3 new places, and her knees ached from the crouching work of low cleaning. She thought, sitting there, about the $7 folded into the back of Wendell's Bible, money she had found the week after the funeral tucked behind the concordance, where he kept things he meant to deal with later, a habit of his she had teased him about more than once. She had almost spent it on flour and lard, the practical thing, the thing a sensible widow with no income would do. Instead, she had walked into the county extension office 2 days later, on an impulse she could not fully explain even to herself, drawn by a flyer nailed to the feed store board, advertising cull ducklings from a hatchery liquidation, birds too small and too weak to sell as breeding stock, priced to move before the county made the hatchery destroy them for disease control. The extension officer, a heavyset man named Paddy, who had known Wendell slightly, had tried twice to talk her out of it, telling her plainly that Runt ducks were a bad investment for a woman with no capital and no help, that half of them would die of the cold before Easter, and the other half would draw predators to whatever ground she kept them on. Odessa had set her $7 on his counter anyway, and told him she would take the whole crate, all 123 of them, because something in her, some stubbornness she had not known she carried until her husband was gone and there was no one left to lean on, wanted one thing in this world that was entirely, uselessly, only her own choice. The ride home from the extension office took the better part of an hour on roads still soft from spring thaw, and by the time Odessa carried the crate up onto her new porch, the sun was already dropping orange behind the tree line, and 3 of the smallest ducklings had gone still and cold in the straw. She buried them behind the shack without ceremony, because there was no time for ceremony, and because she had learned, in the 6 weeks since Wendell's funeral, that grief rationed out in small doses was easier to carry than grief let loose all at once. The remaining 117 she moved into a washtub set close to the stove, banking the coals so the room stayed warm enough through the night, and she slept sitting upright in a kitchen chair beside them with a quilt around her shoulders, waking every hour or so to the sound of peeping to check that none of them had wandered too near the coals or been trampled by their stronger crate mates. Her mother, 3 counties east, in a house Odessa had left at 19 to marry Wendell, had raised chickens and geese the whole of Odessa's childhood, and had taught her without ever calling it teaching the particular vigilance that sick or fragile stock required. The boiled egg yolk mashed fine and fed by fingertip to birds too weak to peck for themselves, the chick grit worked into cornmeal mash, the low steady voice that seemed to matter to frightened animals nearly as much as the food did. Odessa found herself using all of it that first week, hands moving through motions her mother had shown her a decade earlier, motions she had not known she still carried until her body simply began doing them without instruction. By the 5th day, 16 more of the weakest ducklings had died despite everything, but the rest had begun to fill out, down thickening from sparse yellow fuzz into something with more substance, necks steadying, eyes brightening from the dull, glassy look of a dying bird into the sharp, curious look of a living one. Purdy at the feed store, when she came in for more chick starter, allowed that keeping 100 head of cull duck alive past the first week was better than he'd expected, though he delivered the compliment, if it was one, with the flat tone of a man still waiting to be proven right about the rest. Word travels fast and unkindly in small farming counties, and by the second Sunday, the story of the widow Prine and her 100 sickly ducks had made its way through every pew and porch conversation for 10 miles around. Cole's wife Vera, who considered herself a woman of practical Christian concern, stopped by the shack uninvited on a Tuesday afternoon with a basket of eggs she framed as charity and a series of questions she framed as care, though the shape of both made clear she had come mostly to see for herself and report back. She stood in the yard with her arms crossed against a wind that smelled of turned earth and asked Odessa, not unkindly but not gently either, what exactly the plan was here, keeping fowl on ground that could not feed them and would not sell them at any price worth the feed bill. Odessa, up to her elbows in a bucket of chick mash, said only that the ducks needed water and the Paddy had water, and that seemed reason enough for now. Vera's eyes went to the flooded rows behind the shack, 3 acres of standing water gone the color of weak tea, choked at the margins with duckweed and cattail, and something in her expression suggested she was already composing the version of this visit she would tell at supper that night, a version in which the widow had gone a little strange with grief, a version that would spread through the county with more speed and more certainty than the truth ever could. She left without finishing her coffee, and Odessa watched her car bump back down the gravel road before turning to look at the Paddy herself, really looking at it for the first time since she'd inherited it, trying to see it the way Vera saw it, a dead thing, a debt of labor with no return at the end of it, and finding instead that some old habit of Wendell's had lodged itself in her without her noticing, a habit of watching water and waiting to see what it would show her. By the start of May, the surviving ducklings had grown enough to manage the short walk down to the Paddy on their own, waddling in an untidy line behind Odessa each morning, like a procession behind a preacher no one had elected, and she had begun letting them range the flooded rows for a few hours at a time, rather than penning them close to the shack. She had expected, based on nothing but instinct, that they would scatter evenly across the 3 acres, foraging for whatever green things and insects a duck finds interesting. Instead, within the first week of open range, she noticed a pattern that repeated itself with a consistency that eventually became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The flock spent the overwhelming majority of its time in the northeast corner of the Paddy, the corner nearest the old capped well that had gone dry sometime before Odessa had ever set foot on the property, working the mud there with a diligence they did not show anywhere else on the acreage. She mentioned it to Purdy at the feed store more out of idle conversation than any real curiosity, and he told her, with the first flicker of genuine interest he had shown in her operation since she'd bought the crate, that ducks were known the world over for going after rice water weevil larvae specifically, that in parts of Asia, farmers had used ducks in flooded rice fields for exactly that purpose for centuries, letting the birds do the pest control that chemicals and drainage cycles struggled to manage. It was, he said, an old trick that had mostly fallen out of fashion in the Delta once cheap pesticide became available after the war, though he'd heard his own grandfather mention duck and rice farming as something they'd tried before that. Odessa walked home, turning the idea over, and that evening she waded into the northeast corner herself for the first time since the funeral, sinking into mud that pulled at her boots with a suction that made her think of quicksand in the picture shows, and found the water there churned nearly opaque, and when she scooped a handful of the disturbed mud up and let it drain through her fingers, what remained in her palm was a mass of drowned and dying weevil larvae, greater in number than she had seen in any one place on the whole ruined acreage. She did not sleep well that night, turning the arithmetic of it over in the dark, the way she used to turn over the farm's books with Wendell at the kitchen table, back when there had still been two of them to worry a problem between. If the ducks were eating the weevil larvae in the mud faster than the weevils could reproduce, and if they kept doing it through the whole of the flooding season the way rice called for anyway, there was no obvious reason the northeast corner could not, eventually, given enough seasons of it, come back to health the way the rest of the farm never had a chance to under her husband's chemical rotations alone. She was no agronomist, and she said as much to herself out loud in the empty kitchen, but she had watched Wendell try nearly everything the extension office recommended and fail, and she had just stumbled, by accident and by $7 desperate, onto something none of those recommendations had ever mentioned. The next morning, she began keeping a record, an old grocery ledger with most of its pages still blank, noting the date, which section of the Paddy the flock had ranged in, and roughly how much visible larval activity she could find when she waded the mud herself afterward to check. It was crude science, the kind a schoolteacher might have marked down for lack of rigor, but it was honest, and within 3 weeks the pattern held steady enough that even her own doubt began to give ground to it. She planted a small test stand of rice in the northeast corner that same week, seed she'd bought on credit from Paddy against a harvest she could not yet promise him, pressing it into mud that had, for 4 straight years, refused to grow anything worth cutting. She told no one what she was doing, not Vera, not Cole, not even Paddy beyond the seed purchase itself, because she had learned already that anything spoken aloud in this county before it bore fruit came back to her, twisted into a story about a grieving woman losing her grip, and she did not have the strength that spring to fight 2 things at once. The test stand came up green within 11 days, which was itself unremarkable, since rice seed germinates readily enough in flooded ground, regardless of what pests wait beneath the surface. What mattered, what made Odessa walk out to that corner every morning before she even started the coffee, was whether the stand would hold past the point where the weevil larvae usually hollowed it out from the roots, the point at which 4 years running the young rice had gone from green to sickly yellow to nothing at all. She watched it through the 3rd week with a held breath she did not fully release even at night, and when the 4th week came and the stand was not only holding but visibly thickening, tillers multiplying the way healthy rice was supposed to multiply, something loosened in her chest that had been wound tight since the reading of the will. She did not celebrate exactly, because a person raised the way she'd been raised did not celebrate a thing until it had proven itself all the way to harvest, but she did allow herself to sit on the bank of that Paddy one evening with her knees pulled up to her chest and watch her ducks paddle through water gone the deep gold of a sun about to set, and think, for the first time in 6 weeks, about something other than what she had lost. It was in that same sitting, watching the light change on the water, that she remembered the ledger Wendell had kept behind the concordance in his Bible, the same hiding place where she'd found the $7, and realized she had never gone back to check whether there was anything else tucked into those pages besides the money. She had been too raw in the weeks right after the funeral to go looking for more of him in that book, afraid of what grief a second discovery might reopen, but sitting there now with mud drying on her shins and 100 ducks working the water in front of her, she found she wanted, for the first time, to know what else her husband had been keeping quiet about. She found the ledger that same night, wedged deeper into the Bible's back cover than the folded bills had been, a slim notebook bound in oilcloth that Wendell must have kept in his coat pocket rather than in the house, given how worn its corners were and how many different pens had marked its pages over what looked like several years. Most of it was ordinary farm bookkeeping, feed costs and seed costs, and the running arithmetic of a man trying to keep three brothers' shared operation solvent through years that were not always kind to rice prices. But tucked into the entries from 4 years back, around the time the Weevil had first taken hold of the northeast corner, she found a different kind of writing, longer passages in Wendell's cramped hand that read less like accounting and more like a man thinking out loud on paper. He had written about an old farmer he'd met at an agricultural exchange in Little Rock, a man recently returned from years working rice cooperatives overseas, who had described to him in detail the practice of running ducks through flooded paddies as a pest control method older than any chemical the extension office could sell him. Wendell had written that he intended to try it on the northeast corner as an experiment the following spring, had even priced out where he might source young ducks, but the entry broke off mid-thought, and the pages after it returned to ordinary bookkeeping with no further mention of the plan. Odessa sat with the ledger open on her knee for a long while, working out the arithmetic of dates, and understood with a slow, spreading feeling she did not yet have a name for that Wendell had died that spring before he ever got the chance to buy the ducks himself, that the plan he'd sketched out and abandoned mid-page had somehow found its way to completion anyway, through her, through a crate of Runt ducklings she had bought on impulse with money she'd found in the very book that held his unfinished intention. High summer came on hard and early that year, the kind of heat that turned the gravel road to a shimmer by mid-morning and drove even the dogs to lie flat in whatever shade they could find, and Odessa's days settled into a rhythm dictated entirely by water and light. She was up before the sun to move the flock down to the paddy while the mud was still cool, spent the middle hours mending fence, tending the test stand, and hauling feed sacks from Purdy's store in a wheelbarrow because she had no truck and no mule of her own to speak of, and returned to the paddy each evening to walk the rows checking the rice for the yellowing that had haunted that corner for 4 years running. It did not come. The stand that had started as an 11-day experiment had by July become nearly a full acre of deliberately reseeded rice, thickened and darkened to the deep green that meant healthy roots below the waterline, and Odessa had begun, cautiously, to let herself imagine an actual harvest at the end of the season, rather than the total loss everyone, including her own father-in-law, had all but promised her. The flock itself had grown from 101 survivors into something closer to a working herd, ranging the paddy in loose formations that Odessa had learned to read the way a shepherd reads sheep, could tell by the pattern of their movement which sections of mud still held larvae worth chasing and which had already been worked clean. Her hands by midsummer had thickened with calluses in places they'd never calloused before, her forearms browned and corded from hauling water and feed, and she had lost the soft roundness of face that Vera had once remarked on approvingly at her wedding, though what replaced it, a leanness and a set to her jaw, seemed to unsettle the people who saw her now more than the softness ever had. She had stopped, by midsummer, waiting for anyone's approval of what she was doing, had stopped even glancing toward the road to see whether Cole's truck might slow as it passed. The paddy had become, in the space of one long hot season, entirely her own business. In a way, no piece of ground had ever belonged to her before. Not every part of that summer went easily, and Odessa was careful in later years never to tell the story as though it had. A storm in late July flooded the paddy past its levees and drowned 9 ducks that got trapped against the fence line in the current, and she spent 2 days afterward repairing the break with fence wire she could not really afford, working alone in mud up to her knees because there was no one to call for help who would come without also bringing an opinion about how she'd gotten herself into this mess. A week after that, a fox took 4 more birds in a single night, slipping through a gap in the wire she had missed in her exhaustion, and she woke to feathers scattered across the yard and felt something close to despair for the first time since the funeral, sitting on the porch steps at dawn with her head in her hands while what remained of the flock milled uncertainly around her feet. It was Purdy, of all people, who showed up that same morning unannounced with a roll of proper fence wire and a younger cousin of his to help her restring the whole perimeter, an act of help he explained gruffly as good business, since he'd extended her credit on feed and seed and had an interest now in seeing the operation survive, though the way he stayed past noon and refused any payment for his own labor suggested the arithmetic of his kindness ran deeper than he was willing to admit out loud. Odessa took the help without arguing, having learned by then that pride was a luxury a widow farming ruined ground could not always afford, and by evening the fence held tight and true around the whole 3 acres for the first time since she'd inherited it. She stood at the gate afterward watching the surviving flock settle for the night, counting them by habit though she knew the number by heart, and understood that the summer had taken its toll in blood and feathers same as it had given back in green rice, and that both were simply the cost of the thing she had decided, without ever quite deciding out loud, to keep doing. August brought a visit she had not asked for, and could not easily refuse, when Cole drove out to the shack on a Sunday afternoon, under the pretense of checking on her welfare, and spent most of the visit instead walking the fence line of her 3 acres, with an expression she recognized, uncomfortably, as calculation rather than concern. He had heard from Purdy, or from Vera, or from the general slow leak of information that moved through the county regardless of anyone's intention, that the widow's Paddy had actually put up a rice stand this year, and he wanted to see it for himself before he decided how much weight to give the rumor. He stood at the edge of the northeast corner for a long while, saying nothing, running his thumb along a stalk the way their father used to check for grain fill, and when he finally spoke it was not to congratulate her, but to observe, in the mild tone of a man testing water before wading into it, that it seemed a shame for a woman alone to be managing an operation like this without proper help, and that the family would certainly be willing to discuss some kind of arrangement now that the ground had shown it could produce again. Odessa understood the shape of the offer even though he never said the word buy, understood that 4 months ago, this same corner of the farm had been valued at less than the shack beside it, and that the same brothers who had not wanted it in March were now standing in it in August, doing arithmetic about what a working 3 acres of duck-tended rice paddy might actually be worth to a family operation that could use the extra acreage. She told him, in a voice she was proud of for staying even, that she was not looking to sell, discuss, or arrange anything at present, and thanked him for driving out to check on her welfare. Cole left without pushing further, but she noticed, watching his truck pull away down the gravel road, that he took the long way around the paddy rather than the short way past the shack, as though he wanted one more look at exactly how much of that rice stand had come up green. She went back to Wendell's ledger more often after Cole's visit, reading and rereading the broken-off entry about ducks and weevils and the old farmer from the agricultural exchange, searching the surrounding pages for anything she might have missed the first time through. What she found instead, a few pages further on, dated only weeks before the tractor accident, was a shorter note that she had skimmed past the first time without understanding its weight, a line about speaking to a lawyer in town, not the family lawyer who had read the will, about putting something in writing regarding the northeast corner specifically, in case, Wendell had written, in his cramped economical hand, in case anything happens to me before I get the chance to try this properly. The note ended there, unfinished, the same way the larger plan had ended unfinished, and Odessa understood now that the will she'd sat through in March, the will that had seemed to her at the time like the plain and unremarkable working of a family that simply valued her less than its own blood, may not have told the whole of what Wendell had intended. She drove into town the following week, an expense of gas money she could not really spare, and sat across a desk from the same lawyer who had read the will, asking him directly whether Wendell Prine had ever come to him separately about the northeast 3 acres. The lawyer, a careful man named Holloway, who did not give away much in his face, told her that attorney matters between himself and a deceased client were not something he could discuss freely, but that if she wanted to bring in whatever paperwork she had found on her own, he would be willing to look at it and tell her plainly whether it changed anything about her standing on the property. Odessa drove home with more questions than she'd arrived with, and a new and unfamiliar feeling that the ground she had been quietly saving all summer might have been meant, all along, to be saved by exactly the person who was doing it. Harvest came in September that year, and Odessa cut the northeast acre by hand with a borrowed sickle because she owned no combine and could not afford to rent the counties, working from before dawn until the heat became unbearable, and then again in the cooler hours before dark, binding the stalks into shocks the old way her grandmother had described, but that Odessa herself had never actually done until that week. It was slow, back-breaking work, and by the third day her palms had blistered clean through the calluses she'd built up over the summer, but she counted every shock she stood upright in the stubble like a woman counting money, because in a real sense that was exactly what she was doing. When Paddy came out with his truck to help haul the cut rice to the mill for threshing, he stood for a long moment at the edge of the field looking at the yield before he said anything at all, and when he finally spoke it was to tell her, in the same flat, unimpressed voice he used for everything, that this acre had come in heavier than most of the working ground on the family's home place that same season, heavier than anything that particular corner had produced in the better part of a decade. The mill waited out 2 days later and gave her a number that meant, once she had paid back what she owed Paddy for feed and seed and fence wire, she would have money left over for the first time since Wendell's death, not much, but money that was entirely and only the result of her own 2 hands and a crate of ducks nobody else had wanted. She used some of it to buy proper paper and a stamp, and wrote a letter to a rice cooperative office in Little Rock that Wendell's ledger had mentioned by name, asking whether anyone there might remember a farmer named Wendell Prine, or the older man he'd once spoken with about ducks and flooded paddies, because she wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything else that year, to finish the sentence her husband had never gotten to finish himself. The reply came 6 weeks later, a typed letter on cooperative letterhead from a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who managed correspondence and records for the office, explaining that she had indeed found mention of a Wendell Prine in their visitor logs from 4 years back, listed as attending a demonstration on integrated rice duck farming methods given by a returning cooperative advisor. More than that, Mrs. Alcott had located a follow-up card in their files, a note Wendell himself had apparently mailed back to the office some months after the demonstration, inquiring about sourcing duck breeding stock for a small trial on his own land, a letter the office had answered but never heard back from, and which they had simply filed away without further thought once the correspondence went quiet. Odessa read the letter twice at her kitchen table, and on the second reading understood something that settled into her chest with a weight she had not expected. Wendell had not simply written down an idea and let it die with him by accident. He had actively pursued it, had written to a cooperative office and asked real questions and begun real inquiries in the months and weeks before his death about doing exactly the thing she had ended up doing herself by accident and desperation a year later. The tractor had rolled before he could act on any of it, before he could buy the ducks or run the trial or tell anyone in his own family what he was planning for a corner of ground they had already, in their own minds, written off as worthless. She sat with that letter a long while, watching lamplight move across its typed lines, thinking about how a dead man's unfinished intention had somehow reached forward across a year of grief and mockery and blistered hands to complete itself anyway, carried not by the person who'd first imagined it, but by the person he had, without ever getting the chance to say so, quietly left it to. She took both the ledger and Mrs. Alcott's letter into town the following week and laid them on Holloway's desk without much preamble, watching his careful lawyer's face as he read through Wendell's cramped handwriting and then the cooperative's typed reply. He was quiet for a long while afterward, tapping one finger against the desk in a rhythm that suggested he was working through something more legal than emotional, and when he finally spoke, he told her that none of what she'd brought him changed the plain fact of the will as written and probated, that the northeast 3 acres were, and remained hers outright with no complications, but that, in his professional opinion, for whatever it might be worth to her personally, the evidence suggested strongly that Wendell had intended that specific piece of ground to become something more than what his brothers assumed it was worth, and had likely left it to her precisely because he trusted her, more than he trusted them, to see that intention through. Holloway said this last part carefully, watching her reaction, and added that he had drawn up enough wills in this county over the years to recognize the shape of a man quietly protecting something he cared about by handing it to the one person he believed wouldn't simply sell it off or let it lie fallow out of spite or grief. Odessa left his office with the ledger and the letter, both folded carefully back into her handbag, and drove home along roads she had driven 100 times that year without ever once feeling the way she felt now, which was less like a widow who had been shortchanged by her husband's family and more like a woman who had been handed, deliberately and with more faith than anyone around her had shown, the one piece of unfinished work her husband had trusted her to complete. Winter came on slow that year, and Odessa spent the quiet months between harvest and spring planting doing something she had not allowed herself time for since Wendell's death, which was simply thinking, turning the whole of the last 9 months over in her mind while she mended fence and repaired the shack's roof against the coming cold. She had gone from a woman handed a crate of dying ducks and 3 acres nobody wanted to a woman with a working rice duck operation that had turned a real, countable profit in its first season, an operation built, not on luck alone, but on the deliberate, unfinished plan of a man who had run out of time before he could act on his own good idea. She thought often about the moment in the county extension office when Paddy had tried twice to talk her out of the purchase, about Vera's flat pronouncement that the land was finished, about Cole's smile at the reading of the will that he had not bothered to hide, and she found, turning those memories over in the cold quiet of the shack in December, that she no longer felt the sting in them she once had. They had not been wrong to think what they thought, given what they knew at the time. Ruined ground and runt ducks were, by any ordinary measure, exactly the burden they had assumed them to be. What none of them had known, what she herself had not known standing in that office with 7 wrinkled dollars in her hand, was that worthless was a word that only held until someone patient enough came along and asked the ground what it actually wanted to grow. She began, that winter, sketching out plans in the back of Wendell's own ledger, in the empty pages after his unfinished entries, for expanding the duck rice method to a 2nd acre come spring, and did not once ask anyone's permission before starting. By the following autumn, the whole county had stopped calling it the widow's folly and started calling it, with a grudging sort of respect that Odessa neither sought nor entirely trusted, the duck operation, as though the ducks themselves had earned the acreage its dignity back, rather than the woman who had kept them alive through a hard first winter. She had expanded to 2 full acres of duck-tended rice by then, had sold a portion of her breeding stock to 2 neighboring farms willing to try the same method on their own troubled ground, and had begun, almost without meaning to, becoming something like the county's quiet authority on a farming practice most of them had never heard of a year and a half earlier. Cole came around again that 2nd September, not with an offer to buy this time, but with a request, awkward and roundabout in the way his requests always were, to borrow some of her breeding ducks for a corner of his own land that had started showing weevil damage for the first time in its history. Odessa agreed, because she had never been the sort to hold a grudge past its usefulness, and because some part of her recognized that the ducks did not care whose ground they cleaned, only that the ground had water and weevils enough to make the work worth doing. She did not gloat, standing in Cole's field a week later, showing his hired hand how to move the flock through the flooded rows the way she'd learned to, because gloating had never been the point of any of it. Not the $7, not the sleepless nights over the wash tub, not the sickle work in September heat. The point, if she could have named it plainly to anyone who asked, had always been simpler than triumph, that her husband had trusted her with something he believed in and never got to finish, and that trust, once she had understood it for what it was, had turned out to be worth more than any acreage the will could have handed her outright. She kept Wendell's ledger the rest of her life, adding to it season after season, until its oilcloth cover wore soft and gray at the corners from handling, and she kept, too, the original washtub from that first cold night, though it had long since been replaced for practical use by proper brooder boxes Paddy had helped her build the 2nd winter. The washtub sat empty in the corner of the shed for decades, and more than one visiting grandchild, years later, would ask her why she bothered keeping a rusted old tub that did nothing anymore, and she would tell them, in the plain, unhurried way she had come to speak by then, that some things earned their keep simply by having been there at the start of something, whether or not they were still useful for anything at all. She never did remarry, though there was no shortage of county opinion over the years about whether a woman running a farm alone was proper or wise, opinion she had long since learned to let pass over her the way water passes over a stone, wearing at it eventually but never in any hurry, never in any way that changed the stone's shape faster than the stone itself intended to change. The northeast corner of the farm, the 3 acres once valued at less than a tenant shack, became in time the most reliably productive ground on the whole property, outperforming even the good bottomland her brothers-in-law had inherited outright, though by then the comparison had stopped mattering to anyone, least of all to Odessa, who had long since stopped measuring her worth against theirs. What mattered to her, sitting on the porch some evenings with grandchildren at her feet, was simpler and quieter than any of that a dead man's unfinished faith in a piece of ruined ground had found its way, through mud and feathers and one hard summer, into something that had fed a family for the whole of a lifetime after. There was one more thing Odessa kept from that first year, a detail she rarely told even to the grandchildren, who asked her again and again to tell the story of the ducks, because it seemed to her too private, too much a thing between herself and a man who was no longer there to confirm it, to hand out easily in conversation. She had gone back once, years later, long after the Paddy had proven itself, and the county had stopped talking about the widow's folly altogether, and dug carefully in the same northeast corner where she'd first pulled the tar-sealed box from the mud, curious whether anything else had settled into that ground over the decades of flooding and draining that followed. She found nothing else buried there, no second box, no further message, and she understood, standing in that same mud with a shovel in her old and steady hands, that there had never needed to be anything more than what she had already found, a handful of scattered notes in a dead man's ledger, a folded $7 behind his Bible, and a piece of ground he had simply believed in without ever getting the chance to say so out loud. Everything else, the ducks, the harvest, the county's slow change of heart, the second acre and the third, had been built by her own hands out of that small unfinished faith, and she had come, over the years, to understand that as the truest kind of inheritance a person could leave behind, not a deed or a sum of money, but a belief in a specific piece of worthless-looking ground, trusted quietly to the one person who would actually walk out into the mud and see what it wanted to become. In her last years, when her legs no longer carried her easily down to the paddy, and a great-granddaughter had taken over most of the daily work of the flock, Odessa would still ask, most mornings, to be helped out onto the porch, so she could watch the ducks make their unhurried way down the worn path to the water, the same path she had first carried them down as newly hatched runts too weak to walk it themselves. She had told the story of the $7 so many times by then that it had taken on the smoothed, familiar shape of a favorite hymn, but she never told it, even at the very end, as a story about proving anyone wrong, because that had never been what it was about to her, not even in the hardest months of that first summer, when proving people wrong might have felt like the only thing keeping her upright. It had been about a piece of ground nobody else wanted, and a dead man's quiet, unfinished trust in it, and 120 ugly ducklings that had turned out, in the end, to be exactly the right hands for a job no one else had thought to give them. The county extension office where Paddy had once tried to talk her out of the purchase, closed decades later, replaced eventually by a modern agricultural center with computers and soil sensors and methods Odessa only half understood when her grandchildren tried to explain them to her, but the northeast corner of the farm kept producing rice every season regardless, tended always by someone willing to walk the water and watch what the mud gave up. On the last morning she was strong enough to make it to the porch rail unassisted. She watched the flock disappear around the bend toward the paddy in the pale early light, and said, to no one in particular, that Wendell would have liked to see how it all turned out, and then sat quietly for a long while afterward, watching the empty path where the ducks had gone, as though waiting to see what else that patient, ordinary morning might still decide to show her.